situations of hopelessness and helplessness. The government gives them the drugs, builds bigger prisons, passes a 3-strike law, and then wants us to sing God Bless America. No, no, no. Not God Bless America. God damn America. That's in the Bible for killing innocent people. God damn America for treating us citizens as human. God damn America.
Hello. It's another week of America's only Halloween socialism podcast.
That's right. We release one episode a year.
Once a year. The King of Skeletons.
I mean, every day is its own year, and every day is Halloween, if you think about it. That's how we look at things over at Pod Damn America. And if you're listening today, congratulations. You've made it to Halloween.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Another year.
I'm excited for it this year. I'm usually a half-assed Halloween costume person. That is usually what I do. I've been known to...
Do you have something planned?
No, so this year I'm going all out. That's the plan anyway.
Really?
It will probably end up being half-assed, knowing me. But
you going all out.
For Halloween, yeah. I usually don't go all out for Halloween. Last year I did. Last year I did this too, because that's what you got to do when you have a girlfriend. You go as a couple, and you have to have a fun costume couple. This year, this is her idea. She's the best ideas.
Please don't keep me waiting any longer.
Please
just tell me what it is.
She is going to be one Jeffrey Epstein, and I'm going to be Ghislaine Maxwell. We're going as Jeff and Ghislaine.
Folks, welcome back to the show. I'm your host for the week, Alex Patak. I'm here with Anders Lee. You may know him as Ghislaine Maxwell from his couple costume, making light of the serial sexual assaults.
Well, okay,
by the Illuminati.
Okay, well, listen, hear me out. I talked her down because she wanted me to go as a victim. She wanted me to go as one of the.
Wow.
Yeah,
that is a terrible idea. I know. What the fuck would that look like? You just dress up like Amanda Palmer? Just wear a body bag? Holy fuck.
Well, it would have been my costume last year. And again, girlfriend's idea, not mine. She was Osama bin Laden, and I was one of his virgins. So I wore a dress.
Okay.
And
wow, Naomi does not fuck around for Halloween, huh?
Yeah. She, I guess when you're a Middle Eastern woman, you don't walk around with a chip in your shoulder. You just go for the funniest thing.
Wow.
Just liberated.
Well, as a white man, the most that I can do is listen.
Mm-hmm. That's all. Yeah. What am I going to correct her?
No. And, you have to dress up as a murdered sexual assault victim and go around and ask for candy.
Well, okay. Ghislaine was in on it. She's a baddie as well.
That's true. You're punching up.
Yeah. She's yet to be apprehended. We'll see what happens.
I actually don't know what I'm going to do because it is. I'm on a show, but it's not a themed show, and I don't really want to dress up.
Do the bare minimum, and that's if you're a fan of the show. Reply to this episode with your half-assed Halloween costumes. Did you go as I have done Hunter S. Thompson one year, and all you do is wear a Hawaiian shirt? I've done that before. Maybe you've been Sigmund Freud, and all you did was wear glasses that are not even round. Maybe you've just gone as quote-unquote myself and annoyed everyone at the party you've gone to.
That one sucks the most.
It's so obnoxious.
Hey, I got a costume for you. It's America dressing up as a democracy for 200 years.
Is that
fascist clothes?
Folks, you know what would be good?
Old man's podcast.
You know what would be good is if I just went as the problem and I was myself.
In a way, you kind of always dress up as the problem.
Yeah, I look like the problem. But I won't anymore. I have to get my hair cut because I actually have longer hair right now than Ghislaine. But well, that's an important segue. It's a good segue too. Today's big news, which is an Epstein family physician, is dishing.
Oh, this is huge.
Yeah. Did you see this? The physician for the family Epstein is saying that it was definitely murder. Some foul play was involved.
I know. We're getting breaking news that Jeffrey Epstein might have been murdered.
Yeah.
I know you've already made your peace with the passing of a friend, but there might have been foul play involved.
I mean,
I'm wondering if maybe we'll have to investigate a little further now.
Right. If only there were like podcasts that were talking about this, you know?
Right. I guess I meant somebody who has some impact on the world and not a series of comedians on their socialist podcast. But yeah, that would be good too. We're doing important work.
Investigation of the Epstein possible murder. He was
Why is no one pushing Bernie to personally solve the Epstein murders in a Scooby-Doo style situation?
I just want to bring your attention to a photo that was taken by a drone of Little St. James Island. It shows a man with salt and pepper hair hours after Epstein's death. Looks very much...
I'm sorry to bother you. My van has merely broken down outside your house. If it wouldn't be too much trouble, myself, my teenage friends, and my talking dog companion stay at your home just for the evening, and we figure a few things out.
Yeah.
That may be something that could happen.
Yeah, I would love to see him going on the case. That's what would happen when we solve all the problems that he wants to fix. That's what I can see him like going down in a basement somewhere and doing the yarn thing and trying to connect the dots on the Epstein business.
Regardless of whether he becomes a detective, his future in any situation involves yarn. We can agree with that, right?
Yeah.
The man just seems like he has access to yarn.
Yeah. That's what he's going to offer guests in the Oval Office instead of like a drink or coffee, a cigarette, as some presidents did. He's going to offer a ball of yarn for them to play with.
I was going to say like a big Castro cigar.
Yeah.
Since we'll have a new Marxist turn for the United Snakes of America. In comedy news, since we're a bit of a dual purpose podcast between...
I'm sorry. I don't know if you got the memo, but we have to pick one.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I said that, and then I was like, no, our two things are Halloween and socialism. So I guess for our third purpose, we do comedy news. We're like journalists for comedy.
No, I mean, we can either be funny or we can have political opinions. But
I made this decision a long time ago.
We're not telling you which one, fans, but we did have decided.
It's a conflict of interest, but
yeah.
But Bernie Sanders' official Twitter account has followed Hannibal Buress.
They followed him. I didn't know that.
They followed him, and his original response was, "Thanks, bro, but I'm still Yang Gang." That was his first response. And that was a few days ago. And, that alone is not newsworthy. That's just a pithy comment from very funny comedian Hannibal Buress from Adult Swim and having a breakdown in Europe. Hannibal Buress. The exciting news is today, Bernie Sanders said that we need universal rent protections. And Hannibal replied, nope. And then offered a link to a landlords union, a landlords foundation, somewhere where you can donate to landlords who aren't even your landlord.
Yeah. I mean, you could tell this was sort of like mom and pop landlords who, because the big boys have their own websites, they have their own lobbyists, they have like well-designed, handcrafted crap. But we forget that there are a lot of landlords out there who that's all they do is they just happen
right.
to
Many landlords are small operations and are also internationally touring comedians.
Yes. Yeah.
What the fuck?
Anybody could do it. It's not
Who
really...
is renting from Hannibal Buress?
I don't know. That would be so
Is Eric
weird.
Andre renting from Hannibal Buress?
I would
be Ranch.
I would only imagine he just like bursts in on his tenants at odd hours of the night and is like, ask them to make him a grilled cheese or something.
Dude, this is the thing because I love Hannibal
I would love
Buress.
that. I would be into that. Yeah,
but like I've been listening to his albums for like 10 years, and every single one of them has at least a 5-minute chunk on how he is just an unhinged human being. And he'll pass it off as really cool, but he'll be like, yeah, I got stopped by the cops in Canada, so I asked them how much money they make and made fun of them for 45 minutes for being poor.
That's it. I feel a little conflicted about that one because they are
okay,
cops.
because that one's cops. Okay, he has another one where he just harasses Scarlett Johansson.
Like he tells a story about how he did this, or he just talks about her body.
Both, but it's like the joke is like Scarlett Johansson has the misfortune of showing up at a club where Hannibal Buress is there, and he just goes around behind her going, Scarlett!
Oh,
Scarlett! And first of all, you're thinking like, this isn't quite a joke. And I'm beginning to worry this man may have access to people's rent.
Yeah, he shouldn't. No one should. But I remember I have some tea to spill about Hannibal. I have heard a rumor.
Okay.
And this is gonna get ugly. This is an awful abuse of power. A thing that he does is he will talk to women and he'll bring them back to his place wherever he's staying, or he'll go home with a woman and force them to watch his comedy.
Is that true?
I've heard that. Yeah, I've heard that from multiple sources.
You feel comfortable sharing that on the radio? That's wild.
It's a terrible, it's a very serious accusation. But that needs to be that type of behavior. I don't think we're going to quell unless people speak out about it. If you know a comedian who does that to you, tweet about it. Me too.
I had to watch a comedy special too.
Tell somebody.
Oh, it appears our guest has arrived.
Hey, guys.
Hello, Daniel.
Hey.
Hello.
Hey.
All right. Well, we were just doing an intro for you, but since you're here, I think we might just start the interview.
Yes.
Sweet.
Welcome to the show. Our guest today is a professor at the University of Washington, Daniel Bessner. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah.
So we were just talking.
We'll move on from Hannibal Buress now.
Yeah. Well, we should get first. We need to get your comment on Hannibal Buress being a landlord. Do you have any thoughts on that? Uh-oh.
Daniel has either frozen or just cannot believe we even brought this up. It really could go either way. I can't tell. All right. Please hold for technical difficulties.
Here comes a new challenger.
Okay. And we're back.
We are joined by a professor of American Foreign Policy at the University of Washington, Daniel Bessner. Thanks for joining us, Daniel.
Thanks for having me, guys.
So we're just chatting about current events. We're talking about Hannibal Buress. Could we, before we get into the nitty-gritty here, do you have any thoughts, perspectives on Hannibal Buress being a landlord?
So, yeah, I was looking into it. So apparently he owns some apartments in Chicago. Is that what it is? Or in Illinois somewhere?
Yeah.
And he kicked some people out because he wanted to turn into an Airbnb. Well, I guess my thoughts are celebrities are your class enemy almost necessarily, and don't forget it. I guess that's my thought on that one.
Fair enough.
No one on the Eric Andre show can be trusted. I've always said this.
Mm-hmm. So that's what's happening in the U.S. That's the national news here. Yeah, the only thing people are paying attention to. But around the world, we got some exciting stuff happening. There's uprisings happening in Chile, in Haiti, in Lebanon. To what extent do you think these are sort of local phenomena? Obviously, they have their own particular issues. But how much of this do you think is a global trend? And where do you see that trend going?
Yeah, well, it's almost like there's a common political, economic cause of these things, right? So I think it's ultimately two things. I think it's the hangover of this global recession that was started 10 years ago is really just, even though it happened a while ago, it's really starting to permeate all of these social structures the world over, right? So you have high unemployment everywhere. You have high youth unemployment in particular. You have high male youth unemployment in a lot of places. And this is ordinarily throughout history a recipe for a lot of social disaster and social protest. So on one hand, it's the obvious sort of political economic causes that I'm sure many people listening will be well aware of. But beyond that, I think it's interesting to look at it as something that's emerging from really what one might call the post Cold War order, right? So you have the Cold War. Cold War ends, there's a particular constellation of forces that is really defined by the United States, and the United States is a world hegemon, it's military power, blah, blah, blah. But it's really in the last 4 or 5 years, in the wake of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, in the wake of the recession as well, that a lot of the legitimacy of the United States as a world hegemonic actor has been totally questioned. So there's a new opening for new types of alliances and new types of social protests that I think you're going to see come to the fore with all of the protests that you mentioned, from Chile to Beirut to Haiti and elsewhere. So I think you have basically the confluence of those two things, economic cause and what might be called the security foreign policy cause. And the question, of course, is how the people with actual military and physical power are going to respond to these things, right? You haven't seen massacres like you saw when, as Gaddafi did when the Libyan protests broke out, or as Mubarak was perhaps thinking about in Egypt, but this is still very much an open question, I think.
Right. So Chile in particular, right now, obviously there's a history of U.S. intervention. It's a, kind of was a test ground for neoliberalism in the 70s and 80s. And now the protests are very strong. There's over 1 million people in the street, but there isn't, to my knowledge, a very strong sort of parliamentary articulation of that uprising. There's not a lot of Chilean politicians who are really representing this sort of hardline anti-austerity point of view. Do you see that changing, or do you think this is going to remain a street movement for the foreseeable future?
Well, I mean, frankly, I'm not a particular expert on Chile, but in general, I think that throughout Latin America, it has to essentially turn into some sort of widespread violent protest for it to have the important long-standing effects that other movements have had throughout history. So in terms of the specifics of Chile, I don't know. But as you said, the fact that it's not articulated in any sort of electoral position leads me to believe that the protests are going to continue. And so then you have, again, the question is, what is the state going to do? Is the state going to do things like try to really impose a very strict martial law? Are they going to start rounding up protest leaders? Are they going to start really trying to use the physical power of the military or the police forces in order to clamp down on the protests? And if they do, then what do the protesters do in relation to that? So the question you're ultimately asking is there some sort of pressure valve that's going to end the protests in a non-massacre, non-violent way? And it's difficult to know. I mean, historically, Latin American governments, most famously in the Mexico massacre of 1968, have actually used military force to intimidate and to threaten what are generally young protesters. It hasn't happened yet in Chile, but I'm not sure that it won't. The sad thing, though, and if we're thinking in terms of foreign policy, is the fact that all of these movements, I mean, there's clearly something global going on, but there aren't very strong transnational links between them, right? In an ideal world, these movements would be linked institutionally in some meaningful sense, where there'd be sending people, they'd be sharing tactics, they'd be sharing strategies. And I'm sure there's some of that going on because of the internet and Twitter and all that stuff. But it's not really yet an articulated movement. And I think this is a problem that the left, broadly speaking, from the United States and elsewhere throughout the world faces, is that it's lack of sort of long-standing mature institutions to turn popular anger and unrest into either policy gains or ideally some sort of new social order is quite limited right now. So the question is, what does that mean for the global left? And the answer is, I don't really know, but it's at least heartening that some people throughout the world, not some people, millions of people, are expressing their anger at the status quo with some form of organized protest.
Yeah, I mean, it's
what's interesting is you can remember just a few years ago for the Arab Spring, a similar kind of unrest was happening, but there was this kind of veneer on it. Like, look, people are using the internet and rising up, and it's going to lead to a wellspring of democracy. And then fast forward just a little bit, there is no optimism anymore.
Right.
It's just a very kind of, you just kind of sit back and watch the fires at this point, it feels like.
Yeah, and this is the problem. I mean, like the problem with the internet generally, if you go back to the 90s, it's all these anarchists talking about how the internet is going to, radically democratize the world, and frankly, what turned out to be a bunch of bullshit because apparently the old power structures are still really important, right? Like actually controlling military and economic power is still really critical in terms of acting in the world. So the question is, and I mean, the question, if we're thinking broadly, is how, and this is like a huge strategic question that we don't have an answer to, is how do you connect this sort of popular anger with a meaningful political, not even reform or revolution, whatever you might want. And I don't really know, right? It's a really difficult thing because what winds up happening, whether it's the Arab Spring or whether it's, the Vietnam moratorium day, is that these protest movements dissipate. People go away, they live their lives, the state cracks down on them, and then it ends. So how do you turn this into a long-lasting reform or revolution is a really important open question that we should be articulating and thinking as sort of lefties.
And that is really interesting. So what are some potential institutions that we should be working towards? Something like an international union or something like the World Social Forum?
Do we need like a blog?
Yeah, I think that's what I was getting at. I think a blog would pretty much solve it. If everyone smoked weed, there'd be no war. But I think that the real thing to do is begin building connections, right? I don't even think we're at the stage of thinking in terms of mature institutions. I think we've all got to come together at convocations like the internationals, the old internationals of the 20th century,
Right.
not ruled in this case by a dictatorial authoritarian Soviet Union, but in a real democratic way, and in a way that the representatives from places like the United States or elsewhere don't dominate the proceedings, which has also been something that's occurred throughout history when you've had these sorts of international convocations, but have them be truly democratic and begin sharing ideas, begin sharing personnel, begin sharing strategies and tactics. And from there, from the connections, from the people connections, then you start talking about and articulating institutions. It's a generational project.
Right. Yeah, I always found it very heartening to look back at the 30s and during the Spanish Civil War with the international brigades, people coming from all over the world to, in that case, fight with arms against Franco. But yeah, that would be so cool to see something like that happening in places like Chile or resisting Bolsonaro, Brazil, and elsewhere around the world.
Who's our Ernest Hemingway?
Yeah.
If you had to pick one.
Hannibal Buress.
One day maybe I would have thought that, but not anymore.
Well, I mean, I think the thing that the whole Spanish Civil War thing was made possible because all these people were really reading each other, right? There was a sense of international solidarity, and the Cold War really, I mean, it killed the left in the United States, the organizational left, because the state made such an effort to destroy it. So I think we're really just now sort of rebuilding these types of important connections, without which it will be impossible to create these sorts of institutions that I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well, something we like to talk a lot about on the show is World War I. We're big WW1 heads on Pod Damn America. Our episode last week was all about it. And specifically, I guess, about how sort of like the Cold War, that was used as a way to really crush the left in America. Do you have any thoughts on that, as well as how, I mean, obviously post World War I, we didn't have as much prestige as we got after the Second World War, but how did that sort of begin to set the stage for American imperialism, the Wilson's victory in 1918?
Sure. That's a really important question. I'll get to it in a second. But one thing just related to the topic we were just talking about, World War One is actually a really critical moment in the international left, because if you look at what people were saying right before the war, the whole prediction was that the workers wouldn't fight each other, right? That some people, some accelerationists at the time were actually not so much in favor of war, but they thought that it would present an opportunity, because once Germany declared war on France and Austria-Hungary and blah, 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 then the workers would all be like, forget this, we're going to not fight this war and we're going to come together. But the fact that they didn't really put a damper on sort of the idea of international solidarity that was popular in the period before 1914. So just to emphasize that, essentially what I wanted to say is that the problems that we were just talking about really go back a very long time, to the beginning of the 20th century, if not earlier. So the idea is we have to figure out a way to actually get the solidarity so that when the wars are declared, the working class doesn't go fight them for the rich. So just wanted to highlight that. But in terms of American,
I feel like we're about to crack it, though.
Yeah, I think we're on the verge. Absolutely, we've got this one. But in terms of the question about imperialism, yeah. So basically, just in brief, the modern era of U.S. imperialism begins really with the War of 1898. What people were probably taught as the Spanish-American War between the Spanish Empire and the emergent American Empire. And of course, this isn't the first moment of American imperialism. You can in fact consider the entirety of Western expansion, which involved the displacement of native peoples, formally, literally sovereign nations with which the United States have had treaties that it repeatedly broke, as really the first classical era of American imperialism. But the first modern era really begins with the War of 1898 and the seizure of Puerto Rico and the Philippines, of course, and various other Spanish territories, making Cuba essentially a protectorate of the United States in a meaningful way. And so that was viewed literally as American imperialism. You know, Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, is writing about this as a way to, express your masculinity. All great empires, all great nation states become empires and they have territories. But what's really critical about Woodrow Wilson and World War One is that he provides American imperialism with a liberal sheen. He makes imperialism and liberalism go directly together, because if you read Wilson's 14-point speeches or you read his ideas about peace without victory, he's essentially saying that the United States is going to emerge as the world's greatest liberal empire, and it's going to use the principles of liberalism to bring peace and justice and democracy to the rest of the world. And of course, this has a long history in the civilizing missions of the British and French empires, and there's an element of it even in the conquests of the Philippines and elsewhere. But it's really with Woodrow Wilson that this idea of liberal imperialism, which is still reflected in the writings of someone like Samantha Power and the policies of Barack Obama, becomes really wedded in the American imagination. So in that sense, World War One is really critical for having this idea that the United States is going to save the world. And what's important, and what you just mentioned, is that this idea of liberal empire came along very much and very consciously with domestic oppression, with the arresting of ethnic minorities, the arresting of socialists, the suspension of habeas corpus in some cases, the opening of mail. All of these actions that were understood to be anti-democratic and illegal were taken during World War One in the name of the emergency of law. So what we have during and after World War One is the articulation of imperialism abroad and at home. And it shows that domestic oppression is directly linked to sort of the idea that the United States is going to be able to remake the world in a particular way, which is what Wilson did. And one more thing, and then I'll shut up, is that Wilson, an important thing to emphasize is that Wilson's notion that he would turn Eastern Europe into a series of nations is very much a reflection of his racism, being, a Democrat who grew up in the post Civil War, the Reconstruction era South, who essentially believed that people of the same races and ethnicities needed to be together. So he's also exporting, with the idea of the creation of nation states in Eastern Europe, a very uniquely American vision of sort of cultural and ethnic homogeneity, which again becomes dominant in the era of nation states after World War One.
Yeah, just the blatant hypocrisy there on the part of Wilson to preach democracy to the rest of the world while he's throwing people in jail for newspapers is just still astounding to this day.
he has real startup guy energy, you know, like half of his ideas are like super big picture stuff that's not grounded in reality at all, but he just has so much enthusiasm for it. You're like, sure, a nation just for Kurds.
Yeah, and he also has Joe Biden energy. The last 6 months of his presidency, he was essentially incapacitated too, right? So we
fantastic.
So we've got a lot of foreshadowing of what we're experiencing today with basically senile or senescent leaders governing the world.
Right, and since you're a historian, I'm going to assume you probably don't like counterfactuals, but we were dipping our toes into this a little bit last week about what would have happened if the U.S. hadn't entered, and someone was pointing out after the fact that France had already kind of said that they would, they had said behind the scenes that they would lock it up if they would pack it up and sign a treaty with Germany if America didn't enter. What implication do you think that would have had?
That's really interesting, and actually, I don't mind counterfactuals because I think they allow you to think in
good.
Yeah, good.
They're fun.
They're fun.
They're fun.
I would never get a job as a professor, but if I did, that's all I would do was just do a class about what if.
It's
good you're up for it because he can't help himself.
Well, I think two things. Well, most importantly, obviously, the Treaty of Versailles would have been different, right? And so you would have removed that, whatever treaty would have been signed, you would have removed things like the war guilt clause, which became very important in 1920s Weimar era Germany in terms of providing
the war guilt clause.
Yeah, so the treaty.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, so Germany
punishing Germany for starting. Okay.
Well, they actually said Germany was formally guilty for World War I, and it was blamed for World War I, which becomes a very important propaganda item in 1920s Germany for basically anti-democratic forces, particularly on the right and particularly the Nazis. So you would get rid of that. You would get rid of sort of the humiliation of Germany with the reduction of the army to 100,000 people, the occupation of the Ruhr region, Germany's industrial heartland. Now the question is there actually no Weimar Republic? Does Germany remain some sort of empire with Kaiser Wilhelm II? And then, you still have these empires, you still have the age of empires and people fighting. So, does the European aristocracy in Central and Eastern Europe not really end? And so if that doesn't happen, what do the political constellations look like? I think it's pretty difficult to tell what that would actually look like. I think you'd get actually probably the expansion of British and French imperialism and German imperialism around the world, a continuation of that, as opposed to it being the first sign in the death knell of those empires. But I think you'd also get, if the United States doesn't enter the war, I'm not sure the United States and various other powers, for example, invade the early Soviet Union, during and after the Soviet Civil War. So if there's no invasion, no basically Western invasion of the Soviet Union, does that mean that Lenin and the early Soviet groups aren't as vicious and brutal in the ways that they were, right? Does the Soviet Union actually have a chance to consolidate its power in a meaningful way? And most importantly, are the seeds of the Cold War not planted, right? Because the Soviet Union, one of the major reasons it will never trust the United States is because the United States invaded it, right? In the years of its earlier infancy. So you have a totally different constellation of what post-war Europe is, and what that looks like, I think, is really difficult to actually, play out.
Well, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that's something we definitely don't learn in U.S. history classes. The troops that were sent in, 1919, I believe, for the counter-revolutionary effort in the USSR.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically that the United States and other Western allies essentially fund anti-Soviet forces, and they literally send troops. I forget the exact year, 1920, maybe even a little bit into 21. But they're essentially trying to destabilize the Soviet Union, right? They're trying to end the experiment in communism for a variety of reasons. One, communism was viewed, as antithetical and anathema to capitalism. But even beyond beyond that, with the imperialism of Wilson, Wilson's not only speaking for Europe at this point, he's really trying to export quote unquote democracy to the rest of the world. So very early on, the idea that some historians have argued in 1918, 1919, there's a choice in what will soon become the post-colonial world, the decolonizing world, among people like Mao and Ho Chi Minh, is should they go with Wilson or should they go with Lenin? Right. And so what they were trying, that's the big choice in 1919. If you're thinking about, you hate the British, you hate the French, right? Are you going to be a liberal or are you going to be a communist? And so that whole constellation changes if the United States doesn't actually enter World War I and doesn't adopt this total global vision of what it wants to do in the world.
Wow. So that was sort of their, what was it, Twilight Taylor versus Robert Pattinson.
Yes,
that's right. That was their Twilight Taylor versus
right.
Robert Pattinson.
Yeah, took the words right out of it.
That's what it is.
That is the title of your thesis. I believe, right?
Yeah.
There's Twilight. Just repeat it. Taylor versus Robert Pattinson.
That shows you how in touch I am with our
the culture of the youth. Future Batman, I think.
With a movie that came out in like 2007.
And just one very, very quick thing. And so, for example, Ho Chi Minh actually tries to meet with Wilson, right? And Wilson doesn't meet with him. Yeah. And so there are all these like wacky things happening and could have taken a totally different direction if the U.S. doesn't enter the war.
And do you think that would have made a revolution in Germany more difficult? Because that's something they tried to kick off right after the war.
Right. So that is partially caused by food shortages, right? The various revolutions throughout Germany, in Berlin, in the north, in Bavaria, that's caused by the depredations of war. And if the war doesn't lead to that, it's very late in the war. If that doesn't happen, are there those food shortages and are there those riots? Tough to know.
Yeah.
Maybe this is cynical of me, but I just would assume if America doesn't enter the war, World War I de-escalates and we still live in an empire age, you still get the same breaking point just 10 years later with something else, right?
I think so. I don't think the European aristocracy was along for the world. The bourgeoisie was going to assert itself somehow. Didn't have to be in the violent, conflagration of World War I. It could have been something else. But yeah, I don't think the empires would have lasted forever, and probably not even very long.
Well, speaking of Weimar era Germany, this is something you've written a bit about, because especially around the time Trump was elected, there's comparisons all the time here in the U.S. about America and the Weimar Republic, saying that this is almost a carbon copy of what happened back then. Obviously, it's not the same, but there are maybe some lessons we can glean here and there when we're comparing the U.S. and the Weimar Republic. What are the similarities and what are the differences?
So the differences are, at least in my opinion, pretty stark. It's difficult to appreciate the total social collapse of Germany in the 1920s, right? You have a totally new political system. You have a bunch of people across the political spectrum who fundamentally rejected democracy, right? Like, in America, there are people who fundamentally reject democracy, but there's a general idea that democracy, even if we don't actually live by it, is a social good. This wasn't true in Weimar Germany. You had people who, on the left and the right, the communists on the left and the fascists and nationalists on the right, who either wanted to destroy democracy and replace it with a proletarian revolution, if you're a Leninist, if you're a communist, if you're a member of the KPT, or if you're a national conservative, you want to bring back the monarchy, or if you're Hitler, you want to basically create a new fascist state. And those sorts of constellations, the fundamental distrust of democracy just doesn't exist in the United States. Another big difference is that the hyperinflation of Germany between roughly 1920 and 1924, there's just no parallel. The levels of unemployment, the inflation where money is literally meaningless, and people were using it as wallpaper or to burn it for heat. Nothing like that really exists in a meaningful way. Also in Germany, you have to remember the industrial heartland, right? What is now the Rust Belt, but what used to be the industrial heartland of the United States. In Germany, that area, the Ruhr region, was occupied, right, for a few years, and you had a guerrilla warfare there. So it's difficult to draw the one-to-one comparison. So I just wanted to emphasize those differences. In terms of similarities, I think you could say there was a lot of inequality in Germany, right? There was a general sense that the system wasn't really working out for everyone. So that is roughly similar. But in my opinion, I wrote this article in Jacobin right after Trump was elected. I think and when we're thinking about Weimar, I think its most potent use in the United States has actually been by liberals who throughout the 20th century have appealed to Weimar in order to justify anti-democratic actions. So, for example, when people are
spicy,
oh, good. Well, hopefully, let's see if I can bring it home. So, when people were creating the national security state in the late 1940s, the CIA, the National Security Council, the NSC, the Department of Defense, these are all creations of the late 1940s. And a lot of people at the time, people like Henry Wallace, who was FDR's vice president and actually the editor of the New Republic for a time, people like that were like, this is not okay, right? This is totally militaristic. This is a state that's going to destroy democracy. This is a state that's going to basically turn America against itself, and we're going to be in an era of permanent war. And it turns out that he was right. But the way that people actually justified these anti-democratic actions was that they appealed to the Weimar Republic. And they said, listen, I wish I could trust American people. I really wish I could. But if you look at the experience of the first half of the 20th century, what you see is, what do the people do? The people vote for Hitler, right? Literally, that's what was used. The people vote for Hitler. And this was important because you got to remember, a bunch of the American elites, the people who are making the national security state in the 40s, literally spent time in Germany in the 20s, right? If you're an elite American, you go to Germany and you actually study at German universities. So George Kennan, one of his first things that he did, one of his first posts was in Weimar, Germany. So to people like Kennan, to these really influential figures, the Weimar Republic demonstrated that you couldn't trust democracy, you couldn't trust ordinary people, and so you needed to create institutions that actually removed people from the policy-making process. And this, throughout the 20th century second half, you constantly see Weimar invoked in this way. When there's student protests against Vietnam in 1960s, oh no, it's the Weimar Republic. When anyone questions American foreign policy in the 1980s and the Soviet Union still is viewed as powerful, oh no, it's the Weimar Republic. And when Trump's elected, oh no, it's the Weimar Republic. So I think that what you have to do is be careful about using what I call the Weimar analogy, because historically that analogy has been used to actually limit democratic participation in American politics.
Yeah, it's funny because the person I've heard do that the most is, I think, Rand Paul. He'll say that a lot.
Yes,
it's like whenever he's talking about, cutting spending, it's like, we have to do this because one day we're going to have hyperinflation if we centralize the economy too much.
When his neighbor breaks into his house to beat him.
Yeah.
It's like the Weimar Republic.
It's true. And also Madeleine Albright, she wrote that book, Fascism, or Timothy Snyder, this historian at Yale, or I don't know if you guys know Yasha Monk. He basically made his whole career arguing in favor of it's always Weimar. And this has become basically a liberal trope. So, when people say Weimar, I reach for my Browning. I think, as Hermann Goering once said, right? It's a bad news generally.
Nice. Extra brownie points for doing the Brecht reference.
It's so strange how that's twisted to become like a failure of democracy. When the Weimar Republic, I mean, if you just look at it, what's the first thing you know about the Weimar Republic? Is it's like
supposed to be materially
a democracy, devoid of resources, right?
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know. You'd think that would be the line.
But when it was founded, the whole idea was that we're going to make a U.S. style democracy here, right?
Yeah, or a parliamentary style democracy.
Parliament, yeah.
More British style parliament. It's not a presidential system.
Sure.
But not only that, people always say Hitler was elected. Hitler actually wasn't elected. Hitler was appointed by a collection of German industrialists. and basically aristocratic Junkers. So like the fundamental thing is that Hitler actually wasn't elected, which people often forget.
Well, do you think you could turn this around and say Weimar is an example for what happens when you don't have enough democracy?
Yeah, well, I think that's true. And to really put, a historical point on it, the Weimar Republic essentially became what historians term a presidential dictatorship in 1930. The president of Germany, pre-Hitler, for 3 years before Hitler, actually ruled as essentially a dictator, right? So well before Hitler, democracy was reduced. And I think that's actually one of the reasons that Hitler was able to be so successful.
I would warn against your ability to actually argue with anybody bringing up the Weimar Republic because they probably are not actually interested in your opinion.
I think that's probably true.
Yeah. Yes, usually a straw man. Well, I mentioned a Rand earlier, Rand Paul, but there is another Rand that you have written quite a bit about, and I believe you have a book. You're working on a book now about the Rand Corporation, sort of an innocuous sounding institution, but it has a pretty storied history in America and sort of began post World War II. Can you talk a bit about American power after the Second World War and sort of the growth of the defense intellectual complex?
Sure. It's difficult to overstate just how powerful America was after World War II, right? I think this is the right statistic. It roughly controlled 50% of world production, something along those lines, right? Because you have a pre-industrial, decolonizing world, a process of decolonization, and Europe has immiserated itself. So the United States, right after World War II, the elites essentially decide that we could never allow this to happen, and that the only way that world peace and security is going to be something that we'll see in our lifetimes is for the United States to totally dominate the world. It's going to dominate the world. It's going to have the largest military. It's going to start expanding its base system so that planes could refuel, so that it could threaten literally everywhere on the world. And of course, the Soviet Union, but also elsewhere. And so you get the rise of this national security state where the logic of the American government becomes the logic of governing the world. But the problem is that the United States had never really developed the area knowledge, the knowledge of other spaces, or the intellectual capacities to actually govern the world. After World War I, it retreated into a period of not really isolationism, what's better referred to as neutrality, but it wasn't really funding, knowledge about other areas of the world. It wasn't really funding knowledge about how to strategically organize the world. So what you have after World War II is that the American state is like, well, we used all of these scientists during the war. They created the atom bomb. They created radar. Radar is an invention of World War II. They created proximity fuses. They created proto-computers, right? So we need to incorporate scientists. We also need to incorporate social scientists, right? We're going to fight psychological warfare. So we need to know, we need to have psychologists. We're going to try to subvert the Soviet Union. So we need sociologists to learn how the Soviet Union is organized so we know the weak points to hit. We're going to learn about foreign cultures and try to win the hearts and minds of what was then emerging as the third world. So we need anthropologists. So what the United States does is that it begins to incorporate intellectuals into its state structure. Now, the problem is that the United States, as you guys both know, is very much a private enterprise place, right? It's not going to want to create, the government, the Ministry of Social Science or the Ministry of Natural Science. So what it does is that it actually uses the implement of the contract, right? The United States actually fought World War II, particularly scientifically, not by incorporating scientists specifically into the state, but by contracting with scientists at places like MIT. At places like Caltech, at places like Harvard. So they weren't formally part of the state, but they were using state money. So what happens after World War II is that they use this same mechanism to create quote unquote independent organizations like the Rand Corporation, which are not actually part of the state, but are almost funded solely with state money. And it's at places like the Rand Corporation that the natural scientists and the social scientists that I just talk about come together. And they essentially begin creating the ideas that literally make the American empire possible. So, for example, elites, military officers and government officials, they want bases, but where the hell do you place your bases? They go to Rand for that question, right? We want to have nuclear propulsion of aircraft, but we don't have the intellectual capacity to do that. You go to Rand for those sorts of questions, right? Another thing they actually researched was a death ray. Right, we want to be able to beam, energy over across the continents to kill people. We'll go to Rand for things like that. So you have the creation of an institution like the Rand Corporation, where all these people come together to fight the Cold War. But again, what I want to emphasize is this is what is so interesting about the American state, and what the left is going to have to deal with it is that the American state, in some regards, is actually pretty weak. What it does is that it contracts out a lot of its functions, and by contracting, it actually makes these functions unaccountable to either Congress or the public, right? And more recently, you see it by the fact that the United States uses an enormous amount of mercenaries to fight its wars. Most of them are veterans, but they're fighting their wars with literal mercenaries. So you have the creation after World War II of this contract state, of which the Rand Corporation is a part.
Okay. I'm sorry, I have to interject here. Could we go back to the death ray just for like a second?
Yeah, sure.
So did we get one?
We did not.
Did I miss something?
we did not get one, but a lot of money was spent on it, right? Because you also have to remember, after World War II, there's an incredible sense of accomplishment because the United States had defeated the instantiation of evil in Nazi Germany. So what they really thought they could do everything. So you have the funding of a bunch of these wacky projects, in addition to the death ray, which is the most outstanding of these. You also have a lot of money spent on handwriting analysis, right? You're going to see if Stalin is hypnotizing people by examining their handwriting. And a lot of these wacky projects are funded by the U.S. government after World War II. And we don't even know the half of it because a lot of this stuff remains classified.
I always get military project funding is always the most fun thing to dive into. I always bring up on this show when they were developing napalm propulsion and then just were strapping it to bats for a while.
Oh yeah.
Because they couldn't figure it out.
Oh yeah.
But it's just so great to put a face to the F-35 of the 1950s.
Yeah.
Where did all the money go,
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead, please.
And the scientists, they took advantage of this, right? I mean, unsurprisingly, they thought a lot of the military elite were pretty stupid. So what they would do is that they would sort of create these fanciful projects in order to get money to work on what they actually wanted to. And another thing one thing I want to quickly emphasize is that a lot of the guys at Rand, you might be surprised to learn, especially the early people in the 40s and the 50s, were self-avowed socialists, right?
Nice.
They really consider themselves to be social democrats. And what they were doing, they're we could be social democrats at home, but we'll have to dominate the world, or there'll be a Hitler, or there'll be a Stalin. And not only were they social democrats, they were kind of avant-garde people. So the guys at Rand, before LSD became a thing in the 60s, in the 50s, they were taking acid and driving down the PCH, the Pacific Coast Highway, at 80 miles per hour in their convertibles. So they were very much avant-garde people who liked Lenny Bruce, who liked jazz, and they considered themselves to be part of this progressive project to govern the world. It's hard to think of now, but that's really what they thought they were doing.
And was a lot of that because they had just defeated fascism?
Exactly, right. This really made them think that the American state could be used for good.
That does give you a pass, I guess.
The one,
or I guess not a pass, but you could convince yourself maybe the death ray has a good function later.
So a lot of this is in the 50s, and I'm wondering how much dissent there was in American discourse. I'm a big fan of all people who lost the election. Was Adlai Stevenson somebody who was speaking out against all the spending, or was there really anybody voicing a problem with it?
So basically, by the Korean War, there is dissent. But the real era of possibility is between 1945 and June 1950. Once the Korean War breaks out, which is generally read in the United States as a communist attack on an American ally, the discourse really closes, and then McCarthyism really ends it. So to even be in the American state after, 52, 53, you kind of have to buy into everything. So Henry Wallace never really has a particularly important position after that time. Even someone like George Kennan, who started off very much as an aggressive Cold Warrior, kind of turns against it in the early 50s, and he also, falls out of favor. So there's a process of sorting between 1950, 1953, 1954 that actually makes it difficult for you to be a dissenter within the United States. And this is really fucked up because I think, at least personally, that the Cold War could have ended in 1955. So Stalin dies in 1953. Really? Yeah. So Stalin dies in 1953. And for a lot of people, it would have been tough to make a deal with Stalin. Fine, whatever. I think you could have, but fine. But in 1955, the Soviet Union is actually like, we don't really want to fight this thing with the United States. So they call something called the Geneva Conference, which is the first time all the leaders of the great powers meet since basically the immediate post-World War II era. And the Soviet Union actually makes serious overtures to the United States, like, we're going to end this. We'll have mutual inspections, blah, blah, blah. We're going to end the Cold War. And the United States beforehand is like, going into the conference is like, we refuse to make any deal with the Soviet Union. We're just going to use it as a propaganda moment, right? We're going to use it to try to justify what we're doing. So it's actually pretty tragic that all of this dissent was kicked out right before the moment when you could have had a military end to the Cold War.
Wow. Damn. So that's just
what else can you say?
But by the end of the 50s, though, this is something that's brought up a lot, particularly when people want to do things like cut defense spending. They'll point to Eisenhower, who of course gave his farewell address. He mentioned the military-industrial complex. He had that quote about how we should be spending more money on hospitals instead of weapons of war. But what was the full picture there? Because he obviously is not a peacenik. Was his what were his real objections? Because I've heard some suggest that may have been more because he didn't want private companies creating these weapons and all these things. He wanted it to be under the thumb of the state.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because very few presidents did as much as Eisenhower to create the military-industrial complex, right? So you have this irony. So Eisenhower is pretty much an early 20th century conservative, is that he ideologically, theoretically at least, believes in small government and that the government shouldn't be spending billions of dollars on building arms, right? But he's also a World War II and Cold War president, where he truly, at the same time, believes that the Soviet Union, and particularly atomic weapons, represents an existential threat to the United States. So throughout his term, he vacillates between these two areas, between wanting to cut military spending or fight the Cold War on the cheap, right? He doesn't want to have a massive army. He wants to fight, mutually assured destruction. He wants to fight the Cold War through deterrence with nuclear weapons. But at the same time, he's spending an enormous amount on research and development for weapons and weapon systems and funneling all this money to private corporations. So I think there's a dialectic within Eisenhower himself where he's unsure of where he aligns, right? And it's not for nothing that it was in his farewell address that he warns against the military-industrial complex, right? And one thing I want to add is that the first thing he warns about is the military-industrial complex. That's what we all remember. Do you know the second thing he warns about? The scientific technological elite, i.e. defense intellectuals. So he's like, we have companies.
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, exactly. We have companies creating weapons, and we also have all of these scientists devoting all of their intellectuals to creating weapons as opposed to, fighting poverty or whatever it may be. So these things go together from the beginning. And I think this is what the left needs to recognize, is that the military-industrial complex goes together with what I call the military-intellectual complex, and that they reinforce each other. The military-industrial complex builds the weapons, but the military-intellectual complex, places like RAND, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Council on Foreign Relations, it's those guys who determine where the weapons are actually deployed. So you need to focus on both as a problem.
They don't get the same spotlight, do they?
They do not.
They do not. So we want to wrap up the next 10 minutes or so. Anders, did you want to bring this back to current day?
Yeah, we should probably do that. Although I would love to ask more. I want to get more info about what Adlai Stevenson's stance on this was.
So basically, just very brief.
Yes.
He's an international organization guy, right?
Okay.
So the dissent that you have within the state, you're not talking about not fighting the Soviet Union. You're not talking really about not fighting the Cold War. What you're saying is that there should be some sort of international organization leading to some sort of international encomium, leading to some sort of world government that will be able to, over time, decrease tensions between the two great powers. And from my sense, that's where Stevenson aligns, right? He's a UN guy, right? He wants international organization to do these things.
Well, that turns out to be a pretty good segue, I think, into the future. And you've written a lot about what a socialist foreign policy could look like in the United States. What would the role for an institution like the UN be if we were to have a president, Bernie Sanders? How many of these institutions would we want to scrap, and how many would we try to reform?
Well, this is the tough thing. I mean, in theory, the UN's not a bad idea, right?
Right.
It's a pretty good idea. The problem is that it's been used for 70 years as a cover for American hegemony, and the problem is that a lot of people in the what we call the global South view it as such. So the question really is: could we reform the UN or any of the the number of international organizations, or are they so discredited and so delegitimized in the eyes of most of the world that we won't be able to actually do that? And I think that's the big question. And the only way we're going to answer that, or the only way President Bernie would answer that, is by actually soliciting the opinions of the rest of the world. Now, the problem is the rest of the world consists of people like Viktor Orban, Duterte, and Bolsonaro, right? So that's another problem, because ideally what we would have wanted to do for the past 70 years as leftists is build organic connections to people on a sub-governmental level, so we don't have to rely totally on a Bolsonaro or on an Orban when we're determining things like, do we scrap or do we reform the United Nations? The problem is we don't have that, right? So essentially, I see Bernie as the first step on an unfortunately long path to actually making international organizations more democratic and more accountable to the global population, which is what we need to do. And in doing so, we need to reconceive of things like the fact that the United States, which is 4% of the world's population, consumes an enormous amount of the world's goods. So I think these things are actually really important to think about.
Yeah. Well,
kind of a spooky note to end on for our Halloween episode.
Yeah, so last night I actually went to a talk with Grace Blakely, she's a British economist, and she wrote this book, Stolen, and she was talking about how, there can be some alarmism when we talk about a potential President Bernie and with things like a capital strike or a capital flight. The banks would try to sabotage the economy. And she was basically saying that, and this is sort of particular to the U.S., but we kind of set the rules for if you're a bank, if you want to become a bank, you got to go through us. Like we decide what is a bank, what's not a bank. The state can do whatever it wants to the banking sector. What we really need to be worried about is the political fallout from a Sanders administration. What are the implications there that we should be attuned to, and how ugly do you think it would get? Is there something on the scale of a coup that could happen here?
Yeah, well, that would be interesting. I mean, historically speaking, at least, presidential systems are more prone to coups than not. They're pretty unstable political systems. And the United States is fairly unique in the world that it's never experienced one. But at the same time, I'm not sure the military, it would really have to be a military thing. And I'm not sure the American military is going to go in and try to overtake Bernie. What I'm most worried about is that there's some sort of recession inherent in capitalism, and that discredits socialism for a generation. That there's some sort of horrible economic thing which we're probably going to get, given the amount of debt and the amount of spending that people are never going to pay back their credit card or student loan debt, and that is just chicken's going to come home to roost at some point. And so I think we really need to worry about that, and that would be a political fallout that I think could last generations.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something really important.
Yeah, that's spooky as well.
Well, there's nothing you can really do about it is kind of the thing, because the inherent system is eventually this is all going to crash. I've been sitting in a WeWork all week. I've never felt less financially stable. What's happening now? So it's not like you don't want to take power because of a recession. You just have to just ride it out either way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to wish a recession on anyone, but like ideally,
please don't.
It would happen like before he got elected, and not after.
Or he could use it as a real revolutionary moment in trying to change the political economy in a meaningful way. I think that it also presents a real moment of opportunity. It could be a way to reorganize. Obama could have nationalized the banks. Bernie would. So that could be a good thing.
Exactly.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed for a recession. Good note to end.
Yeah.
All
no,
right.
to be clear, I do not want that to happen.
It's gonna happen.
It will, yes, but it's still going to be bad. Last question. So, anti-imperialism, the history of it in the U.S. it's a long one, and it's often a very contentious one. There's a lot of infighting. There's still to this day quite a bit of sectarianism. It's very disappointing to me, disheartening a lot of the time when I'll see people who agree on the larger point that the U.S. needs to scale back its presence in the world, but then they get really hyper-focused on one particular issue and, Syria, not that that's not important, but a lot of times I feel like there's a lot of infighting that is counterproductive. How do you think the left can avoid that and sort of work together to have a new economic order and a social democracy in places like the U.S. that doesn't depend on a global empire?
I think we need to recognize first and foremost the way that I put it, like Rome wasn't built in a day, and Rome's not going to be taken down in a day. So
Right.
I think we have to recognize that, drawing down the 800 military bases that the United States has, drawing down, the over $750 billion defense budget, and dealing with how that's going to affect a lot of local communities is going to take a while. So I think we need to be ready for the long haul. And like you said, not get distracted isn't the right word, but not get like hyper focused on tactical issues, and lose sight of the larger strategy, which is to truly begin drawing down this empire that's been built over the last 70 years. Also with recognizing that is that there's going to be a lot of, to use economists speak, suboptimal outcomes when that happens, right? The United States has made a lot of promises, and if the left is serious, it's not going to be able to keep a lot of those promises. So the question is, how are we going to be able to do things like security transition? So to take one example, none of us want a Cold War with China, right? But the United States has guaranteed the security of Japan and South Korea and Indonesia and Taiwan for quite a long time. Right. So what does the removal of American bases and American troops and American aircraft carriers from East Asia actually look like? How are we going to do that in a meaningful way where, China doesn't then just start wars? And I think like no one wants China to, overtake other countries in the region. So how are we going to have some form of meaningful security transition that defends allies who we've made promises to, while also removing the United States from this region? It's not an easy question, right?
Yeah.
Maybe you do say we're going to have to take the risk that China is going to start a war with Japan or South Korea, right? Maybe you do say that, but the thing is, it's a series of questions for which there are no good answers, and knowing that going in is, I think, really important.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, because I had the opportunity to ask Congressman Ro Khanna, friend of the show. I had a chance to ask him a question about this precise issue, and I tried to preface it by saying, like, there are geostrategic implications to just coming home from everywhere, but do you envision a world where we don't have foreign bases on foreign soil? The United States is no longer an empire, and he wouldn't commit to that. He said no, that he doesn't hold that as a value. Do you think something like that should be a litmus test for left-wing politicians we support?
So this is where I think we have to distinguish between our utopian visions of the world and politics. Mm-hmm. So he's a politician. So he's got a lot of constituencies and basically stakeholders that he has to deal with in order to, one, maintain his representative seats, and then two, rise further and get in that position of power. So in terms of a litmus test, I don't think you're going to get it. I think you'll be constantly disappointed if in 2020, 2021, you're asking lefty politicians if the United States should have no foreign bases, and you're expecting yes. Now, for me, I think the United States should have no foreign bases, but I'm a professor and I'm not held to the same, I'm not under the same pressures as politicians. But I would say the idea would be to make that be a litmus test in 10, 15 years, to actually start getting rid of bases now so that it becomes, the Overton window is expanded in a meaningful enough way where someone like Roe would be able to say, I'm going to get rid of all of the bases over time. The United States has made these positive moves in this direction, and it's clear there's not going to be a World War III if we don't have 800 military bases abroad. I think what we have to do as an organized left, both, lefties who would serve in government or NGOs, and also just, the left-wing movement, we need to hold politicians accountable. And by saying we're going to make this a priority. And right now, frankly, the organized left hasn't really made the removal of American military bases a priority like it's made Medicare for all a priority, right? So you can't expect Roe, without any sort of organic movement from below, to start going out and saying we're going to get rid of all the bases. It's up to us to provide him the cover to say something like that.
But
I think my suggestion to Roe would be, instead of being a politician, to be a professional podcaster where you can co-sign wild shit all the time with no consequences.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion.
It's great.
We should just give all power to the UN, make a giant internationalist space federation. There you go. I just said it, and there will be no problems later for it.
Perfect.
That'd be cool. All right. A good note to end on. Daniel Bessner, I've been waiting for years to find a historian that will let me indulge them with counterfactuals. So very excited to finally meet one. Where can people find you?
Well, you could find me on Twitter at @dbessner, and if you could buy my book, gets into a lot of these issues. Yes. It's called Democracy in Exile: Hans Speyer and the Rise of the Defense Intellectual. It's about $25.
All right.
Thanks so much for coming on. This was fantastic.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on.
That was Daniel Bessner. And that's going to be it for us. Follow me on Twitter at Patak Jokes. I'll have all my shows up there if you ever want to see me do comedy. And then listen to my other podcast, Ballin' Out Super. Andrews, you had some plugs?
Yes, at Anders Lee here on Twitter. Redacted Tonight is my other job. And there's an election going to happen in December in the UK. And something very exciting, Momentum, the pressure group that supports Jeremy Corbyn, is asking Americans, specifically DSA members, to help them get Labor in power. And you can find out more about how to help. They need help with phone banking, text banking, and research. So they just need people to dig up info on conservative candidates and find all the racist things they've said. It won't be hard. And if you're interested in that, you can go ahead and email Rosie Carter Rich. Her email address is Rosie, ROSIE.Carter hyphen Rich, RICH, at peoplesmomentum.com. That's Rosie.Carter hyphen Rich at peoplesmomentum.com.
Do it. Go dig up some fun British style slurs on the opposition. You have the time. What are you waiting for? All right. That's going to be us for another week. And this is sign out number 3.
It's finished.
It's finished.